Hello again. This is our Stories of the Old Testament. In this seventh session, we're going to continue with the life of David. He had been anointed by Samuel as a shepherd boy, became a national hero. He became king of Israel after Saul was killed by the Philistines, and then he conquered the city of Jerusalem as his new capital. We're going to pick up the story at that point because once David established himself in Jerusalem, he turned his attention to the conquest of the various enemies that surrounded Israel. If we look at the map here, we can see that Israel contained various cities, most of which were Canaanite at that point, but were controlled by the Israelites. And Jerusalem had been one of those, which was now conquered by Jerusalem. The Philistines down on the coast were a continual problem, but he was also surrounded by other groups, such as the Amalekites, and the Edomites, and the Moabites, and the Ammonites, and the Arameans, who were a developing group up to the northeast around Damascus. And with continual warfare, we know that David was a fighter king. He led his troops from the front and fought with them. And with the passage of time, David was able to incorporate all of these different cultures into the kingdom of Israel. And this is the territory that was controlled by David, and it was the territory that was inherited by Solomon upon the death of David. It actually only reached about 15 miles off to the east beyond the Great Rift because it was desert beyond that. These were tiny, tiny little kingdoms, and there were many of them that were contesting with one another for a little piece of the pie in this part of the world. The layout of the city of Jerusalem plays a part in one of the stories of David, and I particularly like this photograph. This is the city of Silwan, which is directly across the Kidron Valley from the excavations at the city of David. This is a modern Arab town, but it's terraced on the hillside the way Jerusalem would have been terraced. And the large, expensive houses at the top of the hill are certainly preferable to the ones on the slopes of the hill because of issues of water runoff and sewage and debris. But the layout of a city such as this gives an image to the story of Bathsheba. Because we would have been, David would have had his palace up at the highest point on the city, at the northern end of the city. And then with him at a high point, he would have been looking down on layers of houses which had flat tops and were small cuboidal structures. They might be 1 or 2 stories high, but they would have a flat roof with stairs leading up to them where people would be able to take the air and perhaps sleep when it was hot in the summer. And it was a very sensible way to build houses, unless you're in a terraced environment like this, which creates problems of privacy. We are told that David was up at his palace looking out over the city, and he saw a beautiful young lady bathing herself, washing herself on the roof of one of the houses just below him. Now, the particular word that was used in that case meant that she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanliness, from her menstrual cycle, which means, unfortunately, also that she was capable of conceiving a child, and this is exactly what happened. But there are those who would interpret the story a couple of different ways. It's unlikely that she would have been bathing herself without knowing that there were people above who could be seeing her, and there are those who suggest that perhaps she played a part in the relationship that developed between David and Bathsheba. At any rate, she was brought up to the palace. She spent the night with him, and she became pregnant. This was a terrible crime. This was a terrible sin. It was adultery, and it was a capital offense under Levirate law. Now, perhaps David might have escaped punishment, but certainly Bathsheba would not have escaped punishment if it became known that she was pregnant. Her husband, Uriah, was fighting with the army at Rabbah, which is the modern city of Amnon, and that's across the Great Rift. You would have to go from Jerusalem down to the area of Jericho and cross the rift at that point, and then travel up into the Jordanian highlands to the city of Rabbah. That would be perhaps 50 miles or so, and it would be possible maybe for a soldier to do that in a hard hike in a day, but it was probably a day or two to get over there, and then a couple of days to bring Uriah back. And he was invited by the king to take a weekend at home. Obviously, this was meant to cover up the pregnancy of Bathsheba. And when he refused to do so, David compounded his sin dramatically by writing up a death order, rolling it up in a scroll presumably, and then giving it to Uriah to take back and give to the general Joab over at the siege of Rabbah. And in that it said that he was to be put into the front of the fighting of the city, and then troops would withdraw, leaving him exposed, and he would be at great risk of getting killed at the gate. Let's take a look at where Rabbah is. We are told, first of all, that David wrote the letter to Joab and sent it with him. Sent it with Uriah. This is terrible. Uriah was carrying his death sentence, and he was told to be put in the front line where the fighting is fiercest, and then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down. And that's exactly what happened. The map shows where these cities are located. We have in the highlands of Israel and the highlands of the Ammonites, we have Jerusalem located above the north end of the Dead Sea. And Rabbah is located almost directly across the Great Rift, and then whoever traveled from one side to the other would have a challenging travel of perhaps 40 or 50 miles, depending on how it plays out. And this is a photograph of the walls of Rabbah that have been excavated. This is one end of the fortification at the time that Uriah would have been besieging the city. We get a message back to David. This was probably a week or so later, again with the travel times and the events playing out. It says that the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. Now, this was a terrible thing. To attack a city on foot was difficult, so they usually attacked the gates. And it was around the gates that you have the large towers, and then all of the soldiers would be arrayed on the towers. And as you attacked the gates, the greatest effort at defense would be undertaken. And then if Uriah was put at the front of the force that was going after the gates and everybody else pulled back, he would have been by himself, and it would have been a simple thing for the archers to shoot him, and that's exactly what happened. David eventually married Bathsheba. Of course, this covered up the crime because the child could be credited to him. But Nathan the prophet challenged him, showed him what a terrible sin he had committed, and David, to his credit, showed true remorse. He was forgiven. He was forgiven for this terrible sin and was allowed to continue as king. The Lord was willing to forgive him because he did show true remorse. However, a penalty was imposed. The baby died. He was rather sickly. He survived for a week and then died. And David, at that point, ended his mourning, returned to his functions as king. He returned to his relationship with Bathsheba. She became pregnant again, and that child was born with the name Shlomo, Solomon. And that was the Solomon who would follow David to the throne many years later. Now, David had other sons. We know of 3 of them, but let's take a look at the genealogy of the sons of David. In Hebron, he had fathered 6 sons: Amnon, Caleb, Absalom, Adonijah, Shephatiah, and Itream. Now, 3 of those we never hear from again, but Amnon plays a significant role in the story of David, as does Absalom and Adonijah. The household of David must have been a snake pit. It must have been a terrible situation. You have numerous sons, all of whom are eligible for the throne. They're competing with one another. The various mothers are competing among themselves to put their sons to the fore. The first story that we hear about concerns Amnon. He apparently was the eldest and the heir apparent, and one gets the feeling that he was a young man of privilege, being the prince of Israel, and conducted himself as such. And he was attracted to his half-sister Tamar. Tamar was the sister of Absalom, his half-brother. These two children, Tamar and Absalom, had been born to a different mother. Amnon lured Tamar into his room by claiming to be sick. She brought him some broth to attend to him, and he brutally raped her and then abandoned her for all intents, having ruined her life. She's been disgraced, and her marriageability has been essentially destroyed, as well as her reputation. And Absalom, her brother, was furious, went to David, demanded vengeance, demanded justice, and David essentially ignored the issue. Absalom wasn't content with that, and he bided his time, and a couple of years later, on a hunting trip with Amnon, he had his men assassinate Amnon. Now, this was a terrible crime, obviously. He'd killed the prince of the kingdom. He'd killed David's son. It was a murder. And he fled. He fled to the land of the Geshurites, the land of Geshur. His mother was a Geshurite. She was a daughter of the king of Geshur and had married David, and the region of the Geshurites has now been pretty well identified as the area to the north and east of the Sea of Galilee. So he fled 50 or 60 miles north and remained there for some period of time until David didn't exactly forgive him, but told him that he could return. He did return to Jerusalem. David essentially refused to have anything to do with him. He was given some administrative tasks in Hebron, but over the next few years he was able to assemble a rebellion against his father, the king, and he actually drove David from the city at one point. David had to flee and try to assemble an army to withstand the rebellion by Absalom. Let's take a look at the map again. David fled down, we are told, into the Great Rift, and then across up into the hills leading to Jordan, the modern nation of Jordan, and he established himself at a place called Mahanaim, and there he was able to assemble his forces. Meanwhile, Absalom marched out to Gilead, and it's quite possible, in fact it's more probable, that he would have taken the easier route of going north and then dropping down into the rift at that point and then crossing over into Gilead. This is the area close to Beit Shan, and you saw a couple of sessions ago a view of the Jordan Valley at that point. It's easy to get across, and this is in the region of Yabesh and a couple of the other places that we heard about during the stories of the patriarchs. It was there that they had a battle, and Absalom was killed, throwing David into a severe depression until he was criticized by his general, who said, "You can't ignore your men. They fought for you, and you can't behave this way." So he was able to return to Jerusalem, and he reestablished himself and settled out for the rest of his life. However, there is one other major event that took place that we need to discuss. There was a census that was ordered by David, and as a result of that, which was not permitted under Levirate law, a punishment was placed upon the people of Israel, and as it turns out, it was in the form of a plague. And David, to repair his relationship with the Lord, determined to buy a field on which he would build an altar, and ultimately the field upon which the temple would be built. So he purchased a place called the threshing field of Arana, which was located to the north of Jerusalem. Let's take a look at our map or our diagram of Jerusalem again. If you look at the northern end of Jerusalem, that was a threshing field. It had not been settled. It is regarded as Mount Moriah, and it was the highest place, which is what you needed for a threshing field, so that when the wind would blow across, you could throw the wheat and the chaff up into the air, and it would separate out the heavier and the lighter portions. David was able to purchase this threshing field, and it was there that he built an altar, and ultimately Solomon would build the temple at that location. There was another attempt. It was not a military attempt, but there was another attempt to seize the throne by another son of David. His name was Adonijah. And apparently he believed himself to be the heir apparent, the prince apparent, and had been conducting himself around town in such a way that he was letting it be known that he would be the king. David at this point was bedridden. He was very elderly and was bedridden, unable to keep himself warm, which frequently happens to older people as they age and their muscle mass is reduced in size. They can't generate body heat. And so he was provided with a young woman under the covers simply to provide warmth for his body. He must have been very close to his death at this particular time, because Bathsheba, his wife of many years, had presented herself into his chambers to inform him that Adonijah was conducting himself in such a way that he was already the functional king. And she reminded David that it had been promised to Solomon. The throne would go to him upon the death of David. David checked the facts, found out that Adonijah was indeed traveling around town. His young friends and sycophants and the individuals who were hoping to gain by their relationship with him were following him around, providing him with entertainment, and he was behaving as though he was already the king. Once David discovered this, he had Solomon taken down to the Gihon spring and anointed. Apparently the anointing would take place at that place, which was regarded as an important location. The anointing would take place, and then Solomon returned back up to the highest point in the city, which is where the palace was, and he ascended to the throne right at that point. He had become king. And then we have this, what I find to be an almost amusing passage. Apparently Adonijah was giving a banquet. He was presiding over his group of followers and wannabes and sycophants, and was having this marvelous banquet when somebody came in and whispered that Solomon had just been anointed and is sitting on the throne, and then we're presented with the image of the crowd disappearing. They just they just faded away, obviously wanting to avoid any association with Adonijah at that point. Now, Solomon, at that point, was forced to take the throne. Adonijah would eventually be executed on a pretext that was chosen by Solomon. We'll talk about that in our next session. But with Solomon taking the throne, we are then told about the death of David, which was about 970 BC. At that point, he was about 70 years old, and there is a Bible passage that refers to that. It says that David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. Now, this is kind of unique. Later on, with the adjustment of the Jewish laws and so forth, bodies were never buried within the walls of Jerusalem. But at this particular time, apparently, that was the practice, And while it was a very small town within the walls, only 10 acres, as I mentioned before, there is a small area where some tombs have been found, and it is generally considered to be the area where David was indeed buried. If we look at the map of Jerusalem again, the area in which the tombs are located is roughly as you see there, and here is a photograph of those tombs. There's nothing in them at this time. They're just rock-cut tombs. They're taken right out of the scarp of the city, and they've been long empty, and if there was anything in there, it's gone. But this is considered to be the place where David may have been buried. Now, the Bible goes on to tell us that David had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron, and 33 in Jerusalem. The number 40 is always a problem when we're trying to determine how old people are, or how long they lived, or how many years passed between one event and another. The number 40 crops up a lot. And in many cases, it can be recognized as quite possibly a symbolic number as opposed to an actual number. We have 40 days and 40 nights. We have 40 years in the wilderness. We have judges with 40 sons and 40 donkeys and presumably 40 wives. And so there must be some type of a symbolic use to that number. It has never been satisfactorily explained what the 40 means, but at least in the case of David, we know it was a very real 40 years. 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem, and those add up to 40. Solomon, by the same way, was identified as having been king for 40 years. And that is a number that has been treated as a real number to help us calculate the length of time that various things happened. The Bible then goes on to tell us this. It says that Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. As we're going to see in our next session, the rule was firmly established. He did it with a great degree of brutality and took the throne, and we'll talk about that a little bit next time as well. I wanted to touch on a couple of other issues before we finish up with David. One of the problems that exists with this particular sequence of events and with Solomon is that there are no inscriptions that mention a King David, or at least there hadn't been until the early 1990s. And for that reason, there were many Bible skeptics who were adopting the position that perhaps David was not the king that the Bible suggests. He was not a great king ruling a kingdom, but he was rather just a little tribal chieftain, and that his reputation had been expanded and enhanced simply to make him sound more important. And of course, the same thing was true of Solomon. There were no inscriptions, no writings, nothing outside of the Bible that mentions either of those men. However, in the 1990s, up at Tel Dan, which is the most northern city in Israel, it was being excavated, and in one of the walls they found several pieces of what had been a much larger inscription, probably about the size of a tombstone, maybe bigger. It had been broken up into pieces, and these pieces had been used to help build a retaining wall later on, and they were fortunate to find 3 pieces that fit together very nicely. And when they read that, it turns out to be an inscription by an Aramean king sometime after the reign of King Jehu. And this would be after the death of Solomon and after the Arameans had risen to power. We'll be talking about that in one of our future sessions. But there is a statement on there that makes reference to Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of the house of David. So this is written perhaps 940, 840, more than 100 years after the time of David, and it's making reference to the house of David. Now that's a term that's used for a dynasty. That's a name used for a succession of people from the same family who become king, father, son, grandson, and so on. And so we finally had an inscription that referred to David by name. It created a real firestorm. People were accusing it of being a forgery or trying to argue that it simply was referring to a house owned by a man named David. But as it has been researched, it's been pretty well agreed that this refers to the dynastic line of David, and it is a reference to the man who lived with that name. And it would suggest that if they were referring to the house of David at that point, 100 years later, then it was a very real reference to a king by that name who lived in Jerusalem. Sadly, it's still the only thing that we have that mentions him by name, but nevertheless, at least it is something hard, something inscribed on a piece of stone that mentions him and gives additional confirmation to the historicity of these passages. So in our next session, we're going to talk about Solomon, who took the throne firmly, and we'll follow his reign. I hope you'll join us.
Bible Interact is a group of Bible scholars and biblical archaeologists who promote the Hebraic nature of Scripture and view the two Testaments as one unified message. They explain how they use a first-century approach to searching the Scriptures, and they share their methods and discoveries for discussion and dialogue. They invite your comments and participation on BibleInteract.tv, where you can also find more teachings, self-study quizzes, webinars, and interviews.